The dust rose in thick ochre plumes along the main street of Widow's Well, Kansas, as the rider approached at a steady, deliberate pace. It was the 15th day of August in 1867, when the heat pressed down on the frontier settlement like a blacksmith's anvil, and the air carried the smell of horse sweat, wood smoke, and something else, something faint and foul that drifted from the direction of Silver Creek. The stench reminded Eleanora Voss of rotting eggs left too long in the sun, mixed with the metallic tang of blood on a butcher's blade. The warrior sat tall in the saddle, his buckskin shirt fringed with beadwork and quillwork that caught the hard prairie sunlight. A war bonnet trailed down his back, eagle feathers tipped with horsehair. Each one earned through acts the white men in this town would never understand. He wears it today as a mourning sign for the poisoned children. In town, he usually opts for a simpler headband. In his right hand, held vertical against the sky, was a hunting spear with a fire-hardened ash shaft and a blade hammered from an old cavalry saber. The weapon was not raised in threat. It simply was. But what drew every eye, what made the cowboys lounging outside the painted Savage saloon straighten and squint and then begin to laugh, was the marking on his face. 2 thick black bars ran vertically down each cheek, bisecting his bronze skin from cheekbone to jaw. Across his bare chest, visible through the open collar of his shirt, 3 red chevrons were stacked one above the other, each line broad as a thumb and precise as if drawn with a ruler. White clay dotted the outer corners of his eyes. The design had been applied with care, with ritual, and it had not smudged despite the miles of riding through dust and wind. "Nice face paint, lone wolf," one of the cowboys bellowed, slapping his thigh. His name was Cully, a drover with a missing tooth and a fondness for cruelty, disguised as humor. "You headed to a barn dance or a war party." Another man, older and meaner, named Scarface Sam, for the puckered line across his brow, spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Maybe he's trying to scare the schoolmarm," he drawled, jerking his chin toward the far end of the street. The warrior did not answer. He did not turn his head. He rode forward at the same unhurried walk, his gaze locked on a point ahead, as if the jeering men were nothing more than wind through dry grass. His horse, a sturdy paint gelding with visible ribs beneath the dusty hide, moved with quiet discipline, hooves scraping the packed earth in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. He halted his horse beneath the peeling signboard of the Painted Savage, a cruel joke of a name that the owner, a transplanted Bostonian named Silas Good, thought clever, and only then did his eyes move. They settled on a young woman standing on the boardwalk with a wicker basket balanced on her hip. The basket held slate boards and stubs of chalk, evidence of her profession. She wore a simple gray dress with a high collar, her dark blonde hair pinned back beneath a modest bonnet that shadowed her face from the brutal sun. Her name was Eleanora Voss, and she had arrived in Widow's Well 6 weeks ago to teach the children of ranch hands, immigrants and drifters, who could scrape together the $1-a-month tuition. She stood very still, one hand gripping the basket handle, the other pressed flat against her skirt. Her face was pale, not from the heat, but from something deeper, fear of the painted warrior, or fear of the men laughing at him, or perhaps fear of what would happen next. Her breath came shallow, her ribs tight beneath the whalebone stays of her corset. The warrior's gaze flicked from her to the cowboys, then back. His horse shifted hooves, scraping the earth. The animal's eyes were calm despite the noise, trained to ignore chaos. Then the wind gusted, carrying with it the smell from the creek, sharp chemical underlaid with the decay of dead fish. Eleanora wrinkled her nose, pressing her handkerchief to her mouth. The warrior did not flinch. He spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the sudden stillness each word shaped with the careful precision of a man who had learned English from missionaries and treaty officers, and had chosen to speak it when it served his purpose. "These marks are for the dead children you laughed past." The street stilled. Cully's grin froze mid-laugh. Scarface Sam stopped mid-spit, tobacco juice dribbling down his chin. Even the piano inside the saloon seemed to falter, the tune stumbling over a wrong note before falling silent. Eleonora's breath caught. She looked up at the warrior, really looked, and saw for the first time that the design was not decoration. It was testimony. It was witness. The warrior dismounted in one smooth motion, boots hitting the ground without sound, and stood before her, the spear now held at his side. He was tall, lean, in the way of men who lived hard and ate little, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of creek stones, dark, clear, unreadable. Lines framed his mouth, etched by sun and hardship, suggesting he was perhaps 35, perhaps 40. Age sat differently on men who lived beyond the reach of soft beds and regular meals. "Ma'am," he said, inclining his head a fraction. "My name is Akacheta. I am Cheyenne from the Cheyenne Agency, 20 miles north. I have come to speak truth to your town." Eleonora swallowed her throat dry. Her hand trembled on the basket. She nodded once, uncertain, and then found her voice. I am Eleonora Voss, the school teacher." "I know," Akacheta said. "Your students are sick." Her eyes widened. "How do you?" "Because ours are too." He reached into a leather pouch slung across his chest and withdrew a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. He unfolded it slowly, revealing 2 glass vials stoppered with cork. The liquid inside was cloudy, tinged with gray, like dishwater. Beside them lay chunks of soft, crumbling ore that glinted dully in the sun, and a folded paper covered in careful script, English letters formed with the deliberate slowness of someone for whom writing was a learned skill, not a native tongue. "This water," Akacheta said, holding up one vial so the light passed through it, casting a sickly shadow on the boardwalk, "comes from Silver Creek, 2 miles above your town. It is poison. The ore is from the Silver King Mill, Colorado Territory, owned by giant George McKean. The letter is from Diane, a healer of my people. She has listed the signs: shaking hands, drooling, madness, death." Eleonora stared at the vials, her stomach turning. "The children," she whispered. "Thomas's fingers. And baby Clara." "Yes." A door slammed across the street. Sheriff Dark Dave Harlan stepped out of his office, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. He was a large man, thick through the chest and gut, with a black beard streaked with gray and eyes like chips of flint. Behind him walked Mayor Horatio Pritchard, a narrow man in a dusty frock coat, his mustache waxed to stiff points. Pritchard's hands fidgeted with his watch chain, a nervous habit Eleonora had noticed during their brief introduction 6 weeks ago. "That's enough," Harlan said, his voice flat and hard. "Indian, you got no business here. Turn that horse around and ride back where you came from." Akacheta did not move. He held Harlan's gaze, and for a long moment the street held its breath. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A shutter banged in the wind. Then Eleonora stepped forward, placing herself between the warrior and the sheriff. Her basket shook, but her voice did not. "He has every right to speak," she said. "If there is poison in the water, we need to know." Harlan's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, you're new here. You don't understand how things work." "I understand children are sick." Pritchard cleared his throat, a wet, nervous sound. "Miss Voss, the sheriff is correct. We cannot have unfounded accusations disrupting. Cannot have what Akacheta's voice cut through. Cannot have truth." The wind gusted again, stronger this time, and with it came the smell of the creek, undeniable, unavoidable. Scarface. Sam coughed and turned his head. Cully spat into the dirt, his laughter forgotten. And Eleonora, standing between the warrior and the law, felt the weight of every eye on the street and the heavier weight of the glass vials in Akacheta's hand. She thought of Thomas Lund, 10 years old with freckles and a quick smile, struggling to hold his pencil yesterday morning. She thought of baby Clara, limp and glassy-eyed in her mother's arms. "Not me," Akacheta said quietly, his gaze sweeping the street, taking in the silent watchers, the mothers in doorways, the children peering around corners. "Your town." The silence stretched. Then Harlan spat into the dust and turned away. "You got till sundown to leave," he said over his shoulder. "After that, you're trespassing." Pritchard followed, casting a nervous glance back. Eleonora exhaled, her knees weak. She looked up at Akacheta. "You need to see Dr. Avery. He can test the water, confirm what you're saying." Akacheta studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Show me." She picked up her basket and started down the street, Akacheta walking beside her, leading his horse by the reins. Behind them, the cowboys muttered and laughed uneasily. Cully called out, "Better watch yourself, schoolmarm, Injuns are tricky." She did not look back, but she felt the weight of their stares, and she felt for the first time since arriving in Widow's Well that she had chosen a side. Akacheta had left the Cheyenne agency before dawn on the 13th of August, when the stars were still sharp and the prairie grass silver with dew. He had painted his face by the light of a small fire, each mark deliberate, each color carrying meaning understood by his people, but invisible to the whites. The black bars were for mourning 2 children from his band, a boy of 7 named Tatanka, and a girl of 5 named Winona. Both dead within a week of each other in late July, their bodies racked with tremors and fever that no medicine could touch. The red chevrons were for the others, 3 more deaths among the settlers' downstream deaths that Diane had recorded in her careful way. Questioning mothers, examining bodies, tracing the sickness back to its source. The white clay at the corners of his eyes was for clarity, for the ability to see truth even when others looked away. He had ridden south with the evidence bundled in oiled cloth, following the creek upstream to its source in the Copper Canyon Hills. There, on the 12th of August, he had seen the mine, a raw gash in the earth scaffolding of rough-cut timber ore carts rattling on iron rails. He had seen men with shovels and pickaxes, their faces gray with dust, their eyes hollow. And he had seen the sluice, a long wooden trough that carried water mixed with crushed ore down the slope and directly into the creek. The water that ran from the sluice was milky and foul, leaving a gray residue on the rocks. Giant George McKean's mine. Everyone knew the name. McKean was a man who had come west with railroad money and political connections, a man who paid Sheriff Harlan's salary through donations to the town fund, a man who had Mayor Pritchard in his pocket like a spare coin. The election was scheduled for the 1st of September, just 17 days away, and Pritchard was running on a platform of progress and prosperity, which meant more mining, more jobs, more money flowing into Widow's Well. Never mind the dead fish. Never mind the trembling children. Akacheta had gathered samples water from the sluice water from the creek below, chunks of ore from the tailings pile. He had wrapped them carefully and ridden to the agency where Diane had tested them with methods learned from a traveling naturalist years ago. She had identified quicksilver mercury in dangerous concentrations. She had written her findings in English, knowing that the white authorities would not listen to a Cheyenne woman's spoken word, but might listen to a written document signed with her mark. Then she had given Akacheta the evidence and said, "Go, make them see." So he had ridden to Widow's Well, knowing what he would find: mockery, hostility, perhaps violence, but also knowing that silence was worse. 7 children dead in 3 weeks. 7 small bodies wrapped in blankets and lowered into the earth while mothers wept and fathers stood silent, fists clenched. Now standing in the street with the vials in his hand and the schoolteacher's fierce eyes on him, he felt the first flicker of something he had not expected. Hope. Dr. William Avery's clinic was a narrow room at the top of a steep staircase above the general store. The air inside thick with the smell of carbolic acid and dried herbs. William himself was a man in his early 40s, lean and balding with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the careful hands of someone who had learned to work with precision in the face of chaos. He had come to Kansas from Scotland in 1862, fleeing memories of a dead wife and a practice lost to debt, and had settled in Widow's Well because no one else would take the post. He looked up from his desk as Eleonora and Akacheta entered, his eyes widening at the sight of the painted warrior. But he did not recoil. Instead, he rose slowly, setting down his pen. "Doctor," Eleonora said, breathless, "this is Akacheta. He has evidence that the creek is poisoned." Poisoned? William's Scottish burr was faint but present. Akacheta placed the vials on the desk, followed by the ore samples and Diani's letter. "Mercury," he said. "From the Silver King Mill, Colorado Territory." William picked up one vial, held it to the light, then uncorked it and sniffed. His face paled. He reached for a magnifying lens and examined the ore, then unfolded the letter and read it twice. His lips moved silently as he processed the symptoms listed: tremor, excessive salivation, respiratory distress, cognitive decline, convulsions. "Blast it," he said quietly. "I've been documenting symptoms for 3 weeks. Tremors, cognitive decline, respiratory distress in children and adults alike. I thought it might be influenza or malnutrition. But this," he tapped the letter, "this fits perfectly." "Can you test it?" Eleonora asked. "I can. I have." He heated the muddy sample in a small pan and watched bright beads of quicksilver form and roll like tiny mirrors. "If there's mercury in the water, I can confirm it within the hour." "Then we must act quickly," Akacheta said. "More children will die." William nodded, already reaching for his equipment, a small spirit lamp, a metal pan glass tubes. But as he did, the door at the bottom of the stairs slammed open. Heavy boots pounded up the steps, each impact shaking the thin walls. Sheriff Harlan appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 of his men, hard-eyed ranch hands, with rifles cradled in their arms. "Doctor," Harlan said, his voice cold, "you're not to conduct any tests. Mayor's orders." William stared at him. "You cannot be serious." "Dead serious." Harlan pulled a folded paper from his coat and tossed it onto the desk. "New ordinance signed this morning. All testing of public resources must be approved by the sheriff's office to prevent panic." "Panic?" William's voice rose. "People are dying. People get sick. That's life on the frontier." Harlan's gaze shifted to Akacheta. "And you out. Now. You've got till sundown, remember?" Akacheta did not move. His hand tightened on the spear, but he did not raise it. He had come to Widow's Well unarmed except for the spear and a knife at his belt, a gesture of respect for the treaty signed in 1858 that prohibited Indians from carrying firearms in white settlements without a special permit. He would not break that treaty no matter the provocation. But his silence was louder than any threat. Eleonora stepped between them again, her basket forgotten on the floor. "Sheriff, you have no right." "I have every right." Harlan's hand rested on his revolver, a Colt Army model well worn. "This is my town." "It is our town." She shot back, her voice shaking with anger. "And if you will not protect it, we will." For a long moment, no one moved. The air in the small room felt thick, oppressive. Then Harlan smiled, a cold, humorless thing that did not reach his eyes. "You do that, ma'am. See how far it gets you." He turned and clomped down the stairs, his men following. The door slammed again, rattling the windows. William sank into his chair, head in his hands. "They'll shut me down. They've threatened it before after I spoke against the mine's waste practices at a town meeting last spring. Eleonora looked at Akacheta. He looked back, and in his dark, steady gaze, she saw something she recognized: determination forged in loss. "We don't stop," she said. "No," Akacheta agreed. "We do not." That night, as the sun set like a low fire across the prairie, a rancher named Percival Tate rode up to the schoolhouse on a lathered horse dust, streaking his gaunt face, desperation in his eyes. He was a poor man, thin as a rail, with 2 daughters in Eleanor's class, sweet girls named Lily, age 8, and Rose, age 6, who always came to school with braided hair and scrubbed faces despite their poverty. Percy's wife had died in childbirth 3 years ago, leaving him to raise the girls alone on a hardscrabble ranch along the Green Valley fork of Silver Creek. "Miss Voss," he said, his voice cracking, "please, my cattle are dying. The creek runs through my land, and they're dropping dead by the water. 3 cows in 2 days. I don't know what to do." Akacheta, who had been waiting by the schoolhouse door, his horse tethered to the rail, stepped forward. "Show me." Percy looked at the warrior, at the paint still stark on his face, even in the fading light, and nodded. All right, yes, please." The 3 of them, Akacheta, Eleonora, and Dr. William, who had arrived quietly with his medical bag, rode out under the first stars toward the Green Valley fork of Silver Creek, where the poison ran deepest. The smell hit them first, a thick, organic stench of decay that clung to the back of the throat and made breathing an effort. Percy's ranch was a modest spread along the bend in the creek, a shallow pool where the water slowed before continuing south toward Widow's Well. The land was poor, the soil thin and rocky, but Percy had worked it for 5 years, raising a small herd of cattle and growing just enough corn to feed his family and livestock. Now, as the moon rose pale and indifferent over the prairie, they stood at the edge of the creek and stared at the carnage. 3 cows lay dead in the mud, their bodies bloated, tongues lolling from gaping mouths, eyes filmed with white. Dozens of fish floated belly up in the shallows, their scales dull and peeling. The water itself looked wrong, cloudy, tinged with gray, a thin, oily sheen catching the moonlight and breaking it into sickly rainbows. "This started a week ago." Percy said, his voice hollow. "First 1 cow on the 8th, then 2 more yesterday. I thought it was something they ate, bad grass maybe, or alkali poisoning. But then the fish started dying 3 days back and—" He trailed off, staring at the dead animals. "My daughters drink from this creek every day. We all do." Eleonora felt her stomach twist. She had taught Lily and Rose to write their names in careful cursive just yesterday afternoon. Rose had smiled with pride when she got the letter R perfectly formed, her small tongue peeking out in concentration. "We need samples," William said, kneeling by the water's edge. He pulled glass bottles from his bag and began filling them, his hands steady despite the stench. "If we can prove the contamination to the territorial authorities." A sharp crack split the night. A bullet whined past so close that Eleonora felt the air move beside her ear. She stumbled back with a gasp, her boots slipping on the muddy bank. Akacheta grabbed her arm and pulled her down, pressing her into the mud behind a dead cottonwood log. Another shot, then a third ricocheting off stone with a sharp ping. Laughter echoed from the cottonwoods upstream, harsh and mocking. Hoofbeats pounded, fading fast into the darkness. Akacheta rose slowly, spear-ready, scanning the shadows. But the riders were already gone. He recognized the laughter, Scarface, Sam, and McKean's men warning them off. "Easy," Akacheta said, turning to Eleonora. She was on her hands and knees, breathing hard, her dress soaked with creek water and mud. He crouched beside her, one hand on her shoulder. "Easy, you're safe." She looked up at him, eyes wide, reflecting the moonlight. "They tried to kill us. They tried to scare us." His hand moved to her forearm, steadying her as she stood. The current pulled at their boots, cold and insistent, the water swirling around their ankles. For a moment they stood too close, his chest inches from hers, both braced against the water. He could feel her pulse racing through her wrist, rapid as a bird's heartbeat. "We should go," William said from the bank, his voice tight with fear. Akacheta pulled Eleonora up onto dry ground, then waded back to help William gather the samples. On the gravel, half buried in silt, he found something, a small metal tag stamped with rough letters, Copper Canyon Mercury Area. Nunce 47. He held it up to the moonlight, turning it over. Evidence. Proof. He pocketed it carefully. They rode back toward Percy's lean-to in silence, the weight of the near miss settling over them like a shroud. The night was full of cricket song and the distant howl of a coyote. Percy's dog, a shaggy mutt named Rusty, met them at the fence line, tail wagging. The animal bounded toward them, then mid-stride, staggered. Foam bubbled at its mouth, white and thick, it collapsed, legs twitching. Percy jumped down from his horse and ran to the animal, dropping to his knees in the dust. Rusty convulsed once, twice, then went still, eyes glazing. Percy's hands shook as he touched the dog's fur, his shoulders heaving with silent sobs. Akacheta dismounted and walked to the man. He did not speak immediately. He simply pulled his water skin from his saddle, clean water from a spring north of the agency, and held it out. Percy took it, drank deeply, then wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed by his tears. "We show them," Akacheta said quietly, meeting Percy's gaze. "We make them see." Percy nodded, shoulders still shaking. All right, yes. What do we do?" "We gather proof. We take it to someone who can act." "Who?" "The state health officer and a U.S. deputy marshal in Blue Rock," William said, stepping forward. "He has authority over local sheriffs. If we can present him with irrefutable evidence, water samples, medical records, witness testimony, he can shut down the mine and arrest McKean." Eleonora stood apart, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the dead dog. She thought of Rose and Lily, of Thomas's trembling fingers, of baby Clara's empty eyes. She thought of the cowboys' laughter in the night, the casual cruelty of men who believed themselves untouchable. And she thought of Akacheta's steady hand on her arm, pulling her from the water, his voice low and certain, "You are safe." She was not safe. None of them were. But together, perhaps they could change that. The next morning, August 16th, the three of them, Akacheta, Eleonora, and William, brought the water samples, the ore chunks, and the mine tag to the clinic. William set up his apparatus on the scarred wooden table. A spirit lamp fueled by whale oil, a metal pan blackened by use, a set of glass tubes. And he heated the muddy sample in a small pan and watched bright beads of quicksilver form and roll like tiny mirrors. Eleonora watched as he heated one sample over the flame, the water evaporating slowly to leave a thin residue of gray beads that rolled and shimmered like liquid silver when he tilted the pan. "Mercury." William confirmed, his voice grim. He used a glass rod to collect one bead and placed it on a white cloth. "High concentration. Anyone drinking this water regularly will suffer neurological damage. Children and pregnant women especially. The symptoms match precisely tremor, excessive salivation, cognitive impairment, eventual death." Akacheta stood by the window, watching the street below. His war bonnet and spear leaned against the wall. He wears it today as a mourning sign for the poisoned children. In town, he usually opts for a simpler headband. His face still bore the black bars and red chevrons, in the design undiminished by time. He had not washed them off. They were not decoration. They were testimony. "We need to present this to the town," Eleonora said. "Call a meeting, show them the evidence." Harlan won't allow it, William said. Then we go around him. We speak directly to the people. Before they could plan further, boots pounded up the stairs. The door burst open without a knock. Sheriff Harlan stood framed in the doorway, his Winchester cradled in the crook of his elbow. 3 men flanked him, ranch hands with hard faces and the casual violence of men who knew they would not be held accountable. "Doctor," Harlan said, his voice flat. "I told you yesterday, no testing." William rose slowly, placing himself between Harlan and the evidence on the table. "Sheriff, I have confirmed the presence of mercury in the creek. People need to know. It's a matter of public health. People need to stay calm." Harlan stepped into the room, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He swung the rifle barrel, casually knocking Akacheta's spear aside where it leaned against the wall. The clatter was loud in the small space, deliberate. Akacheta did not flinch. He did not reach for the knife at his belt. He simply stood, arms at his sides, gaze locked on Harlan. But his body had shifted, weight balanced, ready. "You got no authority here, Indian," Harlan said. "Treaty says you can't carry weapons in town. That spear counts. The Treaty of 1858 says I may carry a weapon for hunting and self-defense." Akacheta replied evenly. "I have hunted, and I have defended. You've caused trouble." Harlan turned to William. "And you're about to lose your license to practice." "On what grounds?" "Inciting panic. Practicing medicine without proper oversight." Harlan pulled another folded paper from his coat. "This is a cease and desist order signed by Mayor Pritchard this morning. You're not to conduct any further tests, publish any findings, or discuss this matter publicly. If you do, you'll be fined $50 and your clinic shut down permanently." William stared at the paper, his face pale. $50 was more than he earned in 2 months. Eleonora felt fury rise in her chest, hot and sharp. "You cannot silence the truth," she said. "I can silence troublemakers." Harlan's gaze swept over her, dismissive. "You're a teacher, ma'am. Stick to your schoolhouse and leave town business to those who understand it." He turned and left his men following. The door slammed, rattling the glass jars on William's shelves. William sank into his chair, the cease and desist order crumpled in his fist. "They'll ruin me. I have no money to fight this in court, no connections." "They will, if we let them," Eleonora said. She looked at Akacheta. "You came here to speak truth. We need to make people listen." "How?" William asked, his voice hopeless. Akacheta moved to the window. Below the street was busy townsfolk going about their day, mothers with children, men loading wagons at the general store. He saw Cully and Scarface Sam lounging outside the saloon, laughing about something. He saw Mayor Pritchard shaking hands with a merchant, his smile wide and false. He saw Sheriff Harlan walking toward the jail, rifle over his shoulder, confident in his power. And he saw Hannah Kruger, the German immigrant woman, standing in the middle of the street with baby Clara in her arms. The child's head lolled against her mother's shoulder, eyes half closed, drool soaking the front of her dress. Hannah was crying, silent tears streaking her face as she tried to coax the baby to drink from a bottle. The child would not respond. Akacheta turned from the window and walked down the stairs without a word. Eleonora and William exchanged glances, then followed. He stepped into the street, spear in hand, and stood in the center of the thoroughfare. He did not call out. He did not move. He simply stood, his war bonnet catching the wind, his body a vertical line against the horizontal sprawl of the town, and waited. He wears it today as a mourning sign for the poisoned children. In town, he usually opts for a simpler headband. One by one, people stopped. Conversations faltered. Wagon wheels ceased their rattle. Cully and Scarface Sam looked up, their laughter dying. Pritchard paused mid-handshake, his smile freezing. Harlan turned, hand dropping to his gun. Akacheta raised his voice, not shouting, but loud enough to carry down the street and into the open doorways. "These marks," he said, touching the black bars on his cheeks with one finger, "are for the children who have died. 2 Cheyenne, 3 settlers, 5 small bodies in the earth." He gestured to the red chevrons on his chest. "This is for those who are dying now. For the trembling boy who cannot hold his pencil. For the baby who will not wake." Hannah Kruger looked up, tears streaming down her sunburned face. She held Clara higher, the baby's hand trembling weakly, the tiny fingers twitching. "My boy Thomas can't hold a spoon," she said, her voice breaking. "He shakes so much he can't eat. He cries from the pain in his head." A murmur ran through the crowd, voices rising. Annika, the Swedish laundress who worked behind the hotel, stepped forward, wiping her wet hands on her apron. Her face was tight with grief. "My husband Lars coughs blood at night. We drink from the creek every day. Our well dried up last spring." Another voice, an older man named Jacob, who worked at the livery. "My grandson has the trembles too. Dr. Avery says there's nothing to be done." The murmurs grew louder, spreading like ripples in water. People looked at each other, uncertainty and fear dawning on their faces. They looked at Akacheta's design, at the deliberate marks, and for the first time, they did not laugh. Scarface Sam spat into the dust. "It's just sickness. Happens every summer when the heat comes. Probably cholera." "Not like this," William said, stepping forward with his medical bag. "I have tested the water from Silver Creek. It is contaminated with mercury from the Silver King Mill, Colorado territory. The symptoms are consistent with mercury poisoning, not cholera." "That's a lie," Pritchard said quickly, his voice high and nervous. He stepped into the street, hands raised in a placating gesture. "The mine is vital to this town's economy. Dr. Avery is spreading false rumors to create panic. The water is fine." "Then test it yourself," Eleonora challenged, her voice ringing clear. "Show us we're wrong. Let an independent authority examine the evidence." Pritchard opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes darted to Harlan. Harlan stepped forward, voice hard. "Enough. Everyone back to work. This gathering is illegal. Disperse now or face arrest." But the crowd did not move. Hannah held Clara tighter, the baby's head rolling against her shoulder. Annika crossed her arms, her jaw set. The older man shook his head slowly. "No," Hannah said, her voice trembling but firm. "It's not over. My children are dying." And in that moment, as the sun beat down and the smell from the creek drifted on the wind, the first crack appeared in the wall of silence that had protected McKean and his mine. Harlan's hand moved to his gun, but a voice stopped him. "Sheriff." It was Ursula Schmidt, the telegraph operator, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, who had been watching from the telegraph office doorway. "You shoot an unarmed woman in the street, you'll answer to the U.S. Deputy Marshal yourself. There are witnesses." Harlan hesitated. The crowd had swelled 30 or 40 people now watching. He was outnumbered, and for the first time, uncertain. He spat into the dust. "This isn't over," he said, then turned and walked back to the jail. Pritchard followed, his face pale. The crowd began to murmur, voices rising in question and fear. Eleonora felt her knees weaken with relief. She looked at Akacheta, who stood silent, spear planted in the dirt like a standard. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. "We plan," he said. They met in secret that night, August 16th after dark, in the back room of Percy's lean-to, a cramped space lit by a single oil lamp that cast long shadows on the walls. The room smelled of hay and leather and sweat. Present were Akacheta, Eleonora, William, Percy, Annika, and 2 others, Ursula Schmidt, the telegraph operator who had spoken up that afternoon, and Tiny Tina, a stable girl of 16 with a gift for horses and a fierce loyalty to anyone who treated her kindly. We need to get the evidence to the state health officer and a U.S. deputy marshal in Blue Rock, William said, spreading a hand-drawn map on the rough wooden table. He has authority over local sheriffs. If we can present him with proof, water samples, medical records, witness testimony, he can shut down the mine and arrest McKean. How far is Blue Rock? Percy asked, leaning on the table. His ribs were bruised from a beating the previous week, a warning from Harlan's men after Percy had spoken against the mine at a town meeting. 60 miles southeast, William said, tracing the route with his finger. 2 days' hard ride if the weather holds. Harlan's watching us, Annika said. His men are everywhere. They'll stop anyone who tries to leave town with evidence. 2 routes, Ursula said, tapping the map with her nail. Telegraph and pony. We send a message through the line to alert the marshal that we're coming, and we send someone with the physical evidence by horse. That way, even if one route is stopped, the other gets through. Harlan controls the telegraph office in Scorpion Bend, Annika pointed out. Every message goes through there. He'll intercept it. Not all of it. Ursula's smile was thin, bitter. There's a neutral operator in Lost Horse 20 miles west. His name is Ned, and he owes me a favor. If I can get a message to him personally, he can relay it to Blue Rock through Fort Kearney, bypassing Scorpion Bend entirely. And the pony? Akacheta asked. 60 miles of open prairie, then badlands, William said. Hard ride, dangerous. We'll need someone who can handle trouble, who knows the land. Everyone looked at Akacheta. He nodded once, no hesitation. I'll go with him, Eleonora said. Miss Voss? William began. No. Her voice was firm, brooking no argument. I know the trail. I rode it when I came here from Blue Rock in late June. And I know people in Blue Rock, the pastor of the First Methodist Church, where I attended services before coming west. If the marshal hesitates, I can provide character witness, corroborate the story. Akacheta met her gaze across the table. It will be dangerous. Men will follow. There may be shooting. I know. He studied her face in the lamplight, seeing the determination there, the fear beneath it, and the courage to act despite the fear. He nodded. All right. Percy cleared his throat. I'll move my girls to my sister's place in Millerville tomorrow, get them away from the creek. Then I'll help however I can. Harlan's men already know I'm involved, and they made that clear when they beat me. I'll keep the horses ready. Tina said, her young voice steady. Fast ones with good wind. You'll need speed more than strength. They planned into the night, working out details, contingencies, fallback positions. William copied his medical ledger by hand, listing every case of mercury poisoning he had documented over the past 3 weeks, 23 names ranging in age from 6 months to 57 years, with symptoms, dates of onset, and outcomes. 5 deaths so far. Annika provided written statements from other families, signed with X marks or careful signatures. Ursula drafted the telegraph message: terse and urgent, mercury contamination, Silver Creek widows, well-stopped children. Dying, stop, send marshal immediately. Stop, medical evidence follows, stop. As the meeting broke up near midnight, Akacheta and Eleonora stepped outside into the cool night air. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the Milky Way, a river of light across the black sky. She hugged her shawl around her shoulders, exhausted and frightened, but resolute. You don't have to do this, Akacheta said quietly, standing beside her. The ride will be hard. There will be danger. Yes, I do. She looked at him, her face pale in the starlight. Those are my students. My responsibility. This is my town now, for better or worse. Your town tried to shoot you last night. Not all of it. She paused, choosing her words carefully. You came here alone, knowing what you'd face. You could have stayed away, let the whites deal with their own poison. He was silent for a moment, staring out at the dark prairie. Then he said, I lost 2 children from my band. Tatanka, who wanted to be a warrior. Winona, who laughed at everything. I will not lose more because I was too afraid to speak. She understood. Loss was not something you walked away from. It was something you carried, and it shaped every choice you made thereafter. We'll leave at dawn on the 18th, she said. The day after tomorrow. That gives us time to prepare. He nodded. Before she turned to go back to the schoolhouse, she reached out and touched his forearm. And the barest brush of fingers, a wordless thank you. He looked down at her hand, pale against his darker skin, then up at her face. Something passed between them, unspoken and fragile, a recognition of shared purpose. Then she walked away into the darkness, and he returned to his camp at the edge of town, where his horse waited and the fire had burned low. The next day, August 17th, chaos descended. Percy rode out at dawn with Lily and Rose, intending to take them to his sister's place in Millerville, 15 miles north. But Harlan's men were waiting on the road. They did not stop him, that would have been too obvious, but they followed at a distance, making their presence known a silent threat. That night, Percy returned to Widow's Well alone, his daughters safely delivered. But when he reached his ranch in the dark, he found a warning waiting, a rope slung over the barn door, tied in a noose, swaying in the wind. His hands shook as he cut it down, the coarse hemp rough against his palms. He was found the next morning, August 18th, by Tiny Tina, who had come to help him prepare the horses. He was lying in his own yard, beaten bloody. His face was swollen beyond recognition, one eye shut completely, ribs, cracked blood crusted on his shirt. He was alive, but barely too hurt to ride, too hurt to do anything but lie in William's clinic and breathe in shallow gasps. Akacheta, hearing the news from Tina, felt the old anger surge, the instinct to ride hard and fast to the jail, to drag Harlan out and make him answer with blood. His hand went to his knife, and for a moment he saw the path clearly. Violence met with violence, justice delivered at the edge of a blade. But William stopped him, gripping his shoulder with surprising strength. And we make them answerable under the law. William said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. Not martyrs. If you kill Harlan, they'll hang you and bury this story with you. McKean wins. The children keep dying. Is that what you want? Cacheta's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He knew William was right. But the rage did not fade. It simply turned inward, cold and hard. Eleonora came to the clinic that afternoon with a new plan, her face set with determination. We split up. You and I ride to Blue Rock with the samples and the medical ledger. Ursula and William ride west to Lost Horse, send the telegraph through Ned, then take a different trail east to meet us in Blue Rock. That way, if Harlan stops one group, the other still has a chance. Harlan will follow us, Akacheta said, stating the obvious. Then we ride faster. He has 6 men, good riders. Then we ride smarter. She met his gaze. We don't have a choice. The election is in 2 weeks. If Pritchard wins, McKean's power solidifies. This is our only chance. William nodded slowly from where he sat beside Percy's cot. She's right. We leave tonight separately. Akacheta and Miss Voss south toward Blue Rock. Ursula and I west to Lost Horse, then south through Fort Kearney. That evening, as the sun set blood red over the prairie, Eleonora bound Akacheta's hand. He had blistered his palm in the clinic fight 2 nights ago, a long, painful splinter from the broom handle he had used to block a man's knife thrust. The wound was not deep, but it had become inflamed, the skin hot and tight. She worked in silence in the small room behind the schoolhouse, her fingers deft and gentle, wrapping the clean linen cloth tight around his palm and between his thumb and forefinger. When she finished, she tied the ends close to his skin and tucked the loose edge under, securing it. The intimacy of the act, touching his bare skin, tending to his injury, made her acutely aware of his presence and the warmth of his body so close to hers. "Try not to bleed on the treaty," she said deadpan, attempting to lighten the weight of the moment. He looked at her, surprised by the humor. Then, for the first time since she had met him, his mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close. "I will try," he said, his voice warm. They left before dawn on August 19th, slipping out of town while the stars were still bright and the roosters had not yet begun to crow. Acacheta rode his paint-gelding Eleonora on a sturdy bay mare, borrowed from Tina, chosen for endurance rather than speed. The trail to Blue Rock ran east along the creek for the first 10 miles, then cut south through open prairie and badlands, a landscape of broken rock and dry washes. They had ridden less than 5 miles when they heard hoofbeats behind them, faint at first, then growing louder. Harlan's men. Harlan's, 6 of them, pushing hard. "Ride!" Acacheta said, his voice calm but urgent. They ran. The prairie blurred into a wash of brown and gold, the horses' hooves drumming the earth in a rhythm that matched Eleonora's pounding heart. The sun rose hot and fast, dust devils spiraling across the flats like dancing ghosts. Acacheta glanced back and saw the riders gaining Scarface Sam in the lead, rifle across his saddle, his face grim with purpose. A shot cracked sharp and flat in the open air. The bullet went wide, kicking up dirt to their left. Eleonora's mare stumbled over a prairie dog hole, recovered, nearly throwing her. Acacheta wheeled his gelding closer, putting himself between her and the pursuit. "Stay low," he shouted over the thunder of hooves. Another shot, closer this time. The bullet grazed Eleonora's shoulder, tearing through the fabric of her dress and the thin chemise beneath drawing blood. Pain flared sharp and hot. She gasped, clutching the reins with white knuckles, but did not fall. Fear and adrenaline kept her upright. Acacheta saw the blood, saw her sway, and made a decision. He saw the washout ahead, a deep gully carved by spring floods 10 feet wide and twice that deep. No time to go around. He spurred his horse forward, then reached out and grabbed Eleonora's arm with his injured hand, ignoring the flare of pain. "Jump with me," he shouted. She kicked free of her stirrups and swung sideways into his saddle, both of them clinging to the horn as the gelding gathered itself and leapt. The gully yawned beneath them, empty air and sharp rocks. For a moment they were flying. Then the horse landed hard on the far side, jarring them both. Eleonora's mare followed riderless, but trained, clearing the gap with room to spare. The riders behind skidded to a halt at the washout, their horses rearing, unwilling to jump. Curses echoed across the prairie. Acacheta and Eleonora did not wait. They rode on blood streaking Eleonora's sleeve, both breathing hard, hearts pounding in unison. When they finally slowed miles later, near the place called Tornado Alley, where the wind screamed through standing pillars of red stone, Acacheta dismounted and helped her down. She swayed dizzy from blood loss and the shock of being shot, her legs unsteady. "Let me see," he said, his voice gentle but firm. She pulled aside the torn fabric of her dress, exposing the wound. It was a graze across the top of her shoulder, shallow but bleeding freely. Acacheta tore a strip from his own shirt, the buckskin fringe already damaged, and bound the wound tight, his hands steady despite the tremor of anger beneath his calm. His fingers brushed her bare skin, and she shivered, though not from cold. "You saved me," she said quietly, meeting his eyes. He met her gaze, his face close to hers. "You did not leave me when you could have." Their breaths matched, both still shaking from the ride and the nearness of death. His hands lingered on her shoulder, and for a moment the world narrowed to the space between them. dust and sweat and the faint scent of sage on the wind. She could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver beginning to show in the black hair at his temples. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps 38 or 40, and he carried his years with a dignity she found compelling. Then he stepped back, breaking the moment, and the distance returned. "We keep moving," he said. "They'll find another way around." She nodded, and they rode on toward Lost Horse, where Ursula and William were waiting. They reached Lost Horse 2 days later, on the evening of August 21st, exhausted and low on supplies. The town was smaller than Widow's Well, just a handful of buildings clustered around a dry crossroads where 2 wagon trails met. The telegraph office was a narrow shack with a sagging roof and a faded sign that read, "Telegraph 10 cents per word." Ursula was waiting for them outside, pacing nervously. William stood beside her, his medical bag slung over his shoulder, his face drawn with worry. When they saw Akasheta and Eleonora approach, relief flooded their faces. "Thank heavens," William said, hurrying forward. "We thought Harlan caught you." "He tried," Eleonora said, sliding from the saddle. She winced as her shoulder twinged the wound stiff and sore. Ursula's face was pale, her hands twisting together in a nervous gesture. "We have a problem." They went inside the telegraph office, where the operator, a grizzled man named Ned, with tobacco-stained teeth and suspicious eyes, sat at his desk. A half-empty bottle of whiskey stood within easy reach. He looked up as they entered, then looked away, guilty. "Tell them," Ursula said, her voice hard. Ned sighed, rubbing his face. "I sent a message a week ago, August 14th, like you asked Ursula, addressed to the state health officer and a U.S. deputy marshal in Blue Rock, marked urgent. And," William asked, his voice tight, "it never got through." Ned pulled a charred scrap of paper from his pocket and laid it on the desk. The edges were burned black and the ink smudged, but a few words were still legible. "Mercury. Children dying. Copper Canyon." "Someone intercepted it at the relay station in Scorpion Bend," Ned said. "They burn messages they don't like, or they get paid to look the other way." Akacheta leaned forward, his voice quiet but dangerous. "Paid by who?" "McKean." Ursula's voice shook with emotion, anger, guilt, fear. She pulled a small leather ledger from inside her coat and opened it with trembling hands. The pages were filled with neat entries, dates, names, amounts. "I kept this. I was scared, so I wrote everything down. I thought if something happened, someone would find it." She pointed to a line dated June 14, 1867, G. McKean. 50 delay, wire re-water complaints. Paid in gold. Another entry, July 3, 1867, G. McKean. 75, intercept telegraph to Marshall. Paid in gold. "He paid me," Ursula said, tears streaming down her face, now her voice breaking. "Months ago. He said if I didn't delay certain wires, he'd send my little brother Jacob to work in the mine shaft. Jacob is only 12 years old, and he's all I have left after our parents died. I was scared, so I did it. I delayed messages, lost a few. Then I tried to make it right, tried to send the message about the Mercury anyway without telling McKean, but..." She gestured helplessly to the charred paper. "It didn't matter. They control the relay at Scorpion Bend. Every message that mentions McKean, the mine Mercury, or water contamination, it gets burned before it reaches Blue Rock." The room was silent, except for the faint click of the telegraph key, idle now. The weight of the revelation settled over them like a physical thing. William took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes, suddenly looking older than his 43 years. "So, the marshal doesn't know. And if we try to send another message, it'll be intercepted again." "Yes." Ursula's voice was hollow with despair. Eleonora felt the hope drain from her body, leaving only exhaustion. Then how do we ride, Akacheta said, cutting her off. We take the evidence to Blue Rock ourselves. No telegraph, no intermediaries. Just proof delivered in person. 60 miles through open country, William said. Harlan will follow. He knows where we're going. Let him. Akacheta's voice was quiet, but the steel in it was unmistakable. We do not stop. There's more, Ursula said. She flipped to the back of the ledger to a section marked Land Transactions. This is a list of payments McKean made to ranchers for water rights along Silver Creek, except most of the ranchers never agreed to sell. The signatures are forged. She pointed to one name, and Eleonora leaned closer, then froze as if struck. Edward Voss, $200. Water rights Silver Creek Parcel 12, signature E. Voss. Witness H. Pritchard, her uncle, her mother's younger brother, who had owned land near Widow's Well before he died 5 years ago in 1862. She had been told he sold the land to pay debts before his death, that he had been struggling financially. But this, he never sold it. She whispered, her hand hovering over the name, as if afraid to touch it. They forged his signature. Yes. Ursula's gaze was steady, sympathetic. Look at the witness. Pritchard witnessed the signature, which means he knew it was forged. McKean seized the land illegally, then built the mine and started dumping waste. If this ledger goes public, it proves not just the poisoning, but fraud and conspiracy. It destroys McKean's legal claim to the mine and the water rights. Eleonora stared at her uncle's name, written in ink that had not faded. She had idolized Edward Voss, the man who had sent her letters from the frontier when she was a girl in St. Louis, who had spoken of the wild beauty of the plains and the promise of a new life. His death had been sudden, a fall from a horse. They said his neck broken. Now she wondered if it had truly been an accident or if McKean had arranged it to seize the land without opposition. We use this, Akacheta said, taking the ledger from Ursula's hands with the care one would give a sacred object. All of it. The water samples, the medical records, the forged signatures. We bring it all to the marshal. William nodded slowly. We ride to Blue Rock. We deliver the evidence before the election on September 1st. If Pritchard wins, McKean's power solidifies and we'll never be able to touch him. We have 11 days. They rested that night in Ned's shack, taking turns on watch. Akacheta sat by the window spear across his knees, and by the light of a single candle, he painted another red chevron on his chest and the fourth mark for Percy, still lying broken in William's clinic. Eleonora watched him from across the room, her shoulder aching despite William's bandage. Why do you keep adding marks? She asked quietly, unable to sleep. He did not look up his brush, a thin twig with fibers teased out, moving with deliberate care. To remember. Remember what? That the dead deserve witness. He paused, brush hovering over his skin. And that I am still alive to give it. She rose from her blanket and crossed to him, moving carefully to avoid waking the others. Without speaking, she dipped the corner of her kerchief in the water basin on the table and reached toward his face. He went very still, his dark eyes watching her. She wiped a smear of red pigment from his cheek, the touch light and careful, almost tender. He caught her wrist, not hard, not restraining, just holding. Their eyes met in the candlelight. She could feel his pulse steady and strong beneath her fingertips. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, and he released her. Outside, the wind whispered through the dry grass, and the stars turned overhead, indifferent and eternal. Morning brought the news that shattered what remained of their plans. A rider from Widow's Well arrived at dawn on August 22nd, his horse lathered and blowing his face gray with exhaustion and horror. His name was Thomas Greer, a young ranch hand who worked for Percy. "Percy's been hanged," he gasped, nearly falling from his saddle. "No." Eleonora breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Not dead," Thomas clarified quickly, seeing their faces. "But near enough. Harlan's men came in the night. They strung him up in his barn, left him dangling just long enough to make him think he was dying, then cut him down and beat him again. He's alive, but he can't walk, can barely breathe. Doc Avery says his windpipe is damaged." Eleonora felt the world tilt. William swore in Gaelic, a harsh string of words she didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. Ursula covered her face with her hands. Akacheta stood apart, his jaw clenched so hard the muscles stood out like cords. He wanted to ride back to storm the jail to make Harlan pay in blood and screaming. But he forced himself to breathe, to remember William's words from days ago. "We make them answerable under the law. We split the work now," Eleonora said, her voice shaking but determined. She would not let Percy's suffering be meaningless. "Akacheta and I ride to Blue Rock with the physical samples and the ledger. Ursula and William stay here and find another way to get word out, a courier or a different telegraph line that McKean doesn't control. There's a line through Fort Kearney," Ned offered from the doorway. 80 miles north, but it's run by the Army. McKean has no influence there." "Then that's our backup," William said, nodding. "Ursula and I ride north to Fort Kearney, send a message through military channels. You two ride southeast to Blue Rock. One of us will get through." They gathered the evidence with the solemnity of soldiers preparing for battle. The glass vials of poisoned water were wrapped in cloth and placed in Akacheta's saddlebag. The sluices and amalgamation barrels sit upstream across the border in Colorado territory, sending the mercury-laced runoff down into Kansas. The chunks of mercury-tainted ore went into a leather pouch. The mine tag stamped Copper Canyon Mercury Area was tucked into William's copied medical ledger, which listed 23 victims by name. Ursula's ledger of bribes and forged signatures was wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from water. Before they parted, William took Eleonora aside. "If you're caught, don't fight. Give them the evidence and run. Your life is worth more than this." "No," she said quietly, looking him in the eye. "It's not. Those children, they're my responsibility. I won't abandon them." William's face softened with something like pride. He squeezed her hand, then turned away. Akacheta and Eleonora rode out as the sun climbed heat, pressing down like a physical weight. The trail to Blue Rock ran east through Badlands, a harsh landscape of broken rock and dry washes, where water ran only after storms, and then south along the river toward the territorial capital. They pushed the horses hard, stopping only to rest them briefly at midday, when the heat became dangerous. Akacheta's hand, still bandaged from the blister, throbbed with each jolt of the saddle. Eleonora's shoulder ached from the bullet graze, a constant reminder of how close death had come. Neither spoke of the pain. There was no point. At dusk on August 22nd, they reached the bluffs overlooking Silver Falls, where the river narrowed and plunged through a granite gorge in a roar of white water that could be heard for miles. The trail split here. One route crossed the river at the falls, a dangerous ford, but fast. The other followed the ridge south, adding a full day to the journey, a day they did not have. "The river," Akacheta said, studying the churning water below. "We don't have time for the ridge." Eleonora looked at the falls, her stomach sinking. The water was high, swollen by upstream rains that had fallen in the mountains days ago. Foam boiled over the rocks, and the spray hung in the air like smoke catching the last of the sunlight. The current was brutal, capable of smashing a horse's legs or dragging a rider under. "Can the horses make it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't know." He met her eyes honest. Can we? She swallowed hard, then nodded. Yes, we have to. They stripped down what they could, blankets, extra gear, anything that would weigh them down or create drag in the water. The vials and ledgers they lashed to their bodies. Akacheta tied the glass vials to his chest with leather cord wrapped in cloth to prevent breakage. Eleonora strapped the ledgers flat against her back beneath her dress, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with strips of petticoat to keep them secure. They entered the water at the shallowest point where the current was theoretically weakest. But the river grabbed them immediately, pulling at their legs, trying to drag them under and sweep them downstream toward the falls. The horses fought, eyes rolling white with fear, hooves scrambling for purchase on the slick stones. Akacheta went first, testing each step, his spear held horizontal for balance. Eleonora followed close behind, one hand, gripping her saddle, the other reaching toward him. The cold was shocking, stealing her breath, numbing her legs within seconds. The roar of the falls drowned out all other sound. Halfway across, a massive cottonwood branch came downstream, torn loose by the current, as thick as a man's body and studded with broken limbs. It slammed into Eleonora's horse like a battering ram. The animal went down with a scream, throwing her into the water. She vanished beneath the foam, the current dragging her under, tumbling her like a leaf. She couldn't tell which way was up. Her lungs burned. Water filled her nose, her mouth. She was drowning. Then hands seized her arm, iron strong, and she was being pulled against the current. Akacheta had let go of his reins and lunged for her, catching her as the water dragged her past. He pulled, fighting the river, his grip slipping on her wet sleeve. Her head broke the surface, and she gasped, choking, coughing up water. He dragged her against his chest, wrapping one arm around her waist, his other hand gripping a submerged boulder for leverage. The current pressed them together, chest to chest, their legs tangling as they fought to stay upright. She clung to him, both arms wrapped around his neck, her face pressed into his shoulder. "Hold on," he shouted over the roar, his mouth close to her ear. She held on, shaking violently from cold and fear. He could feel her heart pounding against his ribs, could feel her breath ragged and desperate against his neck. For a moment, they were one body against the river, breathing together, fighting together. Then, inch by inch, he dragged them both toward the far bank, using his spear as a prop, his boots finding purchase on the stones. They collapsed on the gravel in a tangle of limbs and soaked clothing, both gasping for air. Her horse swam free and climbed out downstream, shaking and snorting. Akacheta's gelding stood on the bank above them, waiting patiently. They lay there for long moments, breathing hard, the evidence still lashed to their bodies. Eleonora's hands trembled as she checked the ledgers beneath her dress. Damp at the edges, but the oilcloth had held. The pages were intact. "We made it," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Akacheta sat up slowly, water streaming from his hair, and looked at her. Her face was pale, her lips blue with cold, but her eyes were fierce. "Yes," he said. For a moment, neither moved. Then he reached out and brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, his fingers lingering at her temple. His touch was gentle, reverent. She caught his hand, held it against her cheek for a heartbeat. "Thank you." He nodded, unable to speak, past the tightness in his throat, and they stayed like that, alive together, the river roaring behind them. Then they stood, gathered the horses, and rode on into the gathering dark. They reached the ridge above Copper Canyon at midnight on August 23rd, the moon full and bright, casting the landscape in silver and deep shadow. Below, the mine sprawled like a wound in the earth, ore carts on iron rails, scaffolding of rough-cut timber, the dark mouth of the shaft. Most of it was silent now, the workers asleep in their rough barracks. But at the far end, near the sluice and the ditch that fed directly into Silver Creek, lanterns burned with a sickly yellow glow. Akacheta and Eleonora dismounted and crept to the edge of the ridge, lying flat on the rocky ground. Below they saw McKean's men, 4 of them working by lantern light, dumping barrels into the ditch. The liquid sloshed out thick and gray, catching the moonlight with an oily sheen that seemed to glow. Mercury waste poured directly into the water supply without care or conscience. "We need to stop them," Eleonora whispered, her voice tight with fury. "We need to get to Blue Rock," Akacheta countered, practical. "That's our mission." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "If we don't stop this now, more people die before the marshal arrives. Children drink that water tomorrow morning." He knew she was right. He also knew the risk. But the evidence lashed to their bodies was meaningless if the poisoning continued unchecked while they rode for help. "All right," he said, making the decision. "We sabotage the sluice, break the gate so it can't drain into the creek, stop the flow. And then we ride like the wind itself is chasing us." They descended the scree in silence, boots sliding on loose rock that clattered softly in the night. The air at the bottom was thick with chemical stench, stinging their eyes and throats, making each breath an effort. Akacheta led the way to the sluice gate, a heavy timber prop wedged into a notch, controlling the flow of wastewater down the wooden trough toward the creek. He wedged his spear beneath the timber and pried muscles straining. The wood groaned, resisting. Eleonora joined him, pushing with her shoulder despite the pain. The gate shifted. A shout from behind them. One of the men had seen movement in the shadows. "Go!" Akacheta said, heaving with all his strength. Eleonora shoved a barrel over with both hands, spilling its gray contents into the dirt instead of the water. The mercury waste soaked into the ground, rendered temporarily harmless. Akacheta levered the gate free with a final desperate heave, and the timber collapsed with a crash, blocking the sluice. Water backed up immediately, flooding the work area, turning the ground to thick mud. Men ran toward them, shouting. Gunfire cracked sharp, bright muzzle flashes in the dark. A bullet ricocheted off an ore cart with a metallic spang sparks flying. Another shattered a lantern, spilling burning oil and plunging part of the mine into darkness. Akacheta grabbed Eleonora's hand and pulled her into the maze of ore carts and scaffolding ducking beneath beams, vaulting over iron rails. They ran, hearts pounding, lungs burning from the chemical air. A shot passed so close to Akacheta's head that he felt the heat of it. He used his spear to sweep a man's legs, dropping him hard onto the rocks. Eleonora shoved an ore cart with desperate strength, and it rumbled down the track, forcing 2 men to dive aside or be crushed. They fought their way toward the horses, which they had left tethered at the base of the ridge. A bullet grazed Akacheta's forearm, tearing through skin and muscle, blood streaming hot down to his wrist. He gritted his teeth against the pain, but did not slow. Eleonora saw the blood, and without breaking stride, ripped another strip from her already tattered petticoat and bound the wound as they ran her hands, quick and sure. They reached the horses and mounted, spurring hard. Behind them, shouts and gunfire echoed off the canyon walls, but they were free, racing east toward Blue Rock under the pitiless moon. They rode through the night and into the dawn, pushing the horses to the very edge of collapse. The animals' sides heaved foam, flecking their mouths, but they ran on with the courage of creatures who trusted their riders. By mid-morning on August 24th, Blue Rock rose on the horizon, a real town with brick buildings and a train depot and church steeples and the promise of law and order. But Harlan was waiting. His posse blocked the road a mile from town. 6 men, rifles, raised horses spread across the trail in a line. Harlan sat his mount in the center, grim and unyielding, his face like carved stone. "End of the line," he called as they approached. Akacheta reined in Eleonora beside him. He could see the town beyond Harlan's men so painfully close. He could see the depot smoke rising from a train stack. He could see the marshal's office, a brick building with a flag flying. So close. "Give me the evidence." Harlan said, his voice flat. "Right away. I won't follow. You have my word." "Your word is worth nothing." Eleonora said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. Harlan's smile was cold. "Maybe. But you're outnumbered 6-2, and you're just a teacher and an Indian. You think you can fight your way through?" Akacheta glanced at Eleonora. She met his gaze, and he saw the determination there, the absolute refusal to surrender now, after everything. He felt it too, a bone-deep certainty that some things were worth dying for. "We don't stop," he said quietly. She nodded once resolute. They spurred their horses forward at a gallop. Gunfire erupted deafening. Akacheta planted his spear like a lance, using it to hook a rifle barrel aside, then drove his horse directly into Harlan's mount, forcing it to rear and sidestep. Eleonora ducked low over her saddle, clinging with her thighs, as bullets whined past, one so close it tore through her bonnet. They broke through the line by sheer momentum and desperation. Hooves pounding dust, rising in a choking cloud. Harlan wheeled his horse and gave chase, his men following, rage twisting his face. The race became a desperate gauntlet, Akacheta and Eleonora running for the depot. Harlan closing fast, gunfire, splitting the air, townspeople scattering and screaming. Then from the depot, a train whistle blew, long, loud, urgent, cutting through the chaos like a knife. The train pulled in brakes, squealing steam, hissing in great white clouds. The door of the passenger car opened before the train had fully stopped, and a man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, with a silver badge pinned to his vest that caught the sunlight. The state health officer and a U.S. deputy marshal summoned early by Ursula's rerouted telegraph message sent 3 days ago from Fort Kearney. "Harlan!" The marshal shouted, his voice carrying like thunder across the depot square. "Stand down. Drop your weapons now." Harlan hesitated, his rifle half raised, caught between momentum and the sudden presence of authority. The crowd gathering at the depot, 30-40 people drawn by the gunfire, murmured and stared. Akacheta and Eleonora rode straight to the marshal, reining in hard, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones. Both were breathless, bleeding, filthy with dust and blood and creek water. Eleonora pulled the ledgers from beneath her dress, the oilcloth wrapping torn but still protecting the pages. Akacheta untied the vials from his chest, with shaking hands, careful not to break them. "Evidence," Akacheta said, handing the vials to the marshal with both hands, formal as a ceremony. "Mercury poisoning from Silver King Mill, Colorado Territory. Children are dying. Here is proof." The marshal took the vials, held them up to the light. The cloudy gray liquid swirled slowly, ominous. He examined the ledgers, flipping through pages, William's careful notes listing 23 victims, Ursula's record of bribes, the forged signatures on land deeds. "Marshal," Harlan said, riding forward slowly, his voice controlled but desperate. "These people are troublemakers and criminals. They've broken laws, trespassed on private property, incited panic. The Indian assaulted my men. The woman is hysterical." "Shut your mouth, Harlan." The marshal said, his voice flat and hard as iron. He did not look at the sheriff. He looked at the crowd, which had swelled to 50 or more townsfolk, from Blue Rock travelers, from the train farmers from the surrounding country. Anyone here willing to testify about conditions in Widow's Well. A wagon rattled up the street, moving fast. William Avery jumped down, followed by Ursula Percy, bandaged and limping, his throat wrapped in cloth but alive. Tiny Tina and Annika. Hannah Kruger was there too, baby Clara in her arms, the child's eyes still vacant, but her mother's gaze fierce as a hawk's. "I will testify," Hannah said, her voice ringing clear. She held Clara higher so the crowd could see. My daughter cannot speak. She cannot eat without help. My son's hands shake so badly he cannot hold a pencil. We drink from Silver Creek every day. Every day we are being poisoned. And I, William added, stepping forward with his medical bag. He pulled out a second ledger, a duplicate of the one Eleonora carried. I have documented every case of mercury poisoning in Widow's Well over the past month. 23 cases, 5 deaths, names, ages, symptoms, dates of onset. This is not rumor or panic. This is medical fact. Ursula stepped forward, tears streaming down her face, but her voice steady. I took bribes from George McKean. I delayed telegraph messages, intercepted communications. But I kept records of everything. She held up the burned telegram scraps and her ledger of payments. This proves McKean controlled the telegraph system to hide the poisoning. He paid me. He threatened my family. And I let him. That's my sin, and I'll answer for it. But he must answer too. Percy, his voice rough and painful from his damaged throat, said, "They tried to kill me for speaking up. They beat me, hanged me, left me for dead. My daughters drank that water. They're sick. And I won't be silent anymore." The crowd swelled voices, rising townsfolk from Blue Rock, who had relatives in Widow's Well, travelers, who had heard rumors, farmers who had seen dead cattle along the creek. The murmur became a roar. The marshal's face hardened like granite. He turned to his deputies, 3 men who had stepped off the train with him. Arrest George McKean on charges of criminal negligence and fraud. Arrest Sheriff David Harlan for obstruction of justice, assault, and conspiracy. Arrest Mayor Horatio Pritchard as an accessory. Harlan reached for his gun. Akacheta moved faster, stepping in front of Eleonora, his spear angled to hook Harlan's arm before the gun cleared leather. A deputy fired a warning shot into the air. The sound cracked like judgment. The crowd surged forward, angry now, no longer afraid. Harlan's own men, seeing the tide turn and recognizing the futility of resistance, lowered their weapons. One Cully, the drover who had mocked Akacheta days ago, actually disarmed Harlan himself, jerking the gun from the sheriff's hand, with disgust twisting his face. "You went too far, Dave," Cully muttered. "Beating women and killing kids that ain't law. That's just meanness." McKean tried to run, pushing through the crowd toward his wagon. But the crowd blocked him, Hannah first, then Annika, then a dozen others, townsfolk and settlers who had lost children or drunk poisoned water or simply had enough of powerful men who believed themselves above consequence. The sluices and amalgamation barrels sit upstream across the border in Colorado territory, sending the mercury-laced runoff down into Kansas. "You don't get to leave your poison here and walk away rich." Hannah said, her voice shaking with righteous fury. A man stumbled forward from the back of the crowd, Jan the mine bookkeeper, pale and terrified, but determined. He handed William a ledger, hidden beneath his coat. "I'll testify," John said, his voice breaking. "He made me falsify the accounts, the safety reports. I kept the real numbers. He was dumping 10 barrels of mercury waste a week directly into the creek. 10 barrels. I have it all written down." The marshal took the ledger, scanned it, his expression darkening with every page. Then he signaled his deputies. They moved forward and slapped iron manacles on McKean, on Harlan, on Pritchard, who had appeared from somewhere in the crowd, his face ashen. The sound of the irons clicking shut was loud in the sudden silence. And in that silence, Akacheta and Eleonora stood together at the edge of the crowd, bloodied and exhausted and victorious, the evidence finally in hands that would use it justly. The marshal held a public hearing the next day, August 25th, in Blue Rock's Town Hall, a large brick building with high windows that let in the morning sun. The hall was packed with witnesses, spectators, journalists from Kansas City and St. Louis, who had arrived on the evening train drawn by rumors of scandal. William testified, first reading from his medical ledger in a steady clinical voice that nonetheless carried the weight of grief. He listed names and ages: Thomas Lund, age 10, tremor and cognitive decline. Clara Kruger, 14 months, complete loss of motor function. Tatanka, age 7, deceased July 28, 1867. Winona, age 5, deceased July 30, 1867. On and on, 23 names. 5 dead, 18 still suffering. Ursula confessed her role, weeping openly, then presented the burned telegrams and bribe receipts. "I was wrong," she said, her voice raw. "I was scared, and I let fear make me a coward. But McKean used that fear deliberately. He threatened my family. He paid me to be complicit. That doesn't excuse what I did, but it shows how he operates through fear and bribery and violence." Percy testified, his voice barely above a whisper, due to his damaged throat showing his injuries to the court. Hannah held Clara up for all to see, the child limp and unresponsive. John, the bookkeeper, provided the financial records proving McKean had been dumping mercury waste for over a year, falsifying safety reports to territorial authorities, and bribing local officials to ignore complaints. The forged signatures on the water rights documents were examined by a territorial notary and confirmed as fraudulent. John's testimony was damning. He said the mercury was diluted enough by the creek. He said children were naturally sickly on the frontier. He didn't care. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. McKean was charged with criminal negligence resulting in death, fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. Harlan was charged with assault, obstruction of justice, attempted murder, and conspiracy. Pritchard, seeing his life unravel, resigned from office on the spot and agreed to testify against both men in exchange for reduced charges. The mine was shut down immediately by territorial order. The marshal ordered a full cleanup of Silver Creek, supervised by the Territorial Health Office and the Army Corps of Engineers, to be funded by seizure of McKean's assets. Diani, the Cheyenne healer, traveled to Widow's Well with Akacheta in early September, bringing remedies to ease the tremors and cognitive symptoms in those already poisoned teas made from milk thistle and dandelion root poultices for the skin, careful instructions about diet and clean water. The remedies could not undo the damage, but they could ease the suffering. Akacheta stayed in Widow's Well to help with the cleanup. He worked alongside settlers in Cheyenne, laying stone weirs to divert clean water from upstream around the contaminated sections, hauling buckets of mercury-tainted sludge out of the creek bed to be buried deep in clay-lined pits far from any water source. It was slow, back-breaking work under the brutal September sun, but the water began to clear. Fish began to return, small ones first, tentative, then larger ones, as the weeks passed. Eleonora returned to her schoolhouse. The children came back one by one, Thomas with his trembling fingers, though the tremor was lessening with clean water and Diani's teas. Lily and Rose with their father, limping behind them. Percy's throat healing slowly. Others who had been too sick to attend, now able to sit upright and hold pencils. She taught them to write their names again, watching their hands for steadiness, for improvement, celebrating each small victory. One afternoon in mid-September, Akacheta came to the schoolhouse. He stood in the doorway, war bonnet left behind at his camp. Just a man in buckskin with a bandaged arm and dust on his boots. He wears it today as a mourning sign for the poisoned children. In town, he usually opts for a simpler headband. He watched as she guided a child's hand across the slate, forming letters with patience and care. When the lesson ended and the children filed out, she walked outside to meet him. "You're still here," she said, surprised and pleased. "The work is not finished. It will take months, maybe a year. Then I will stay." She smiled, small and tired, but genuine. "You don't owe us that." "I owe the dead," he said quietly, "and the living." They walked together to the creek, where the water ran clearer now, though still tinged with gray in places where the worst contamination lingered. The chemical smell was fading, replaced by the clean scent of flowing water and growing things. Fish darted in the shallows, small minnows, but alive. "I'm sorry about your uncle," Akacheta said as they stood on the bank. She knotted her throat tight. "I thought I knew him, but maybe I didn't. Or maybe he was honest, and McKean had him killed to take the land without opposition. A fall from a horse is easy to arrange." She looked at him sharply. "You think that?" "I think men like McKean do not stop at forgery when murder is simpler." She considered that, her hands clenching. "I'll ask the marshal to investigate. If my uncle was murdered, I want to know." They stood in silence, watching the water. Then Akacheta pulled his canteen from his belt and offered it to her. She drank the water clean and cold, then handed it back. Their fingers brushed as she did, and the contact sent a small jolt through her, unexpected and not unwelcome. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For coming here, for speaking when no one else would, for saving my life. Multiple times. You fought too. You did not run when you could have." "We fought together," she said, meeting his eyes. "Yes," he agreed, and the word carried weight beyond its simplicity. That night, a windstorm rattled the shutters of the teacherage, howling across the prairie with the fury of autumn arriving. Eleonora sat on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the wind and feeling very alone. A knock at the door made her start. She opened it to find Akacheta, his war bonnet left behind, just the man he wears it today, as a mourning sign for the poisoned children. In town, he usually opts for a simpler headband. "The storm," he said, gesturing to the shaking walls. "Your roof is shaking. I thought you might be. I wanted to make sure you were safe." "Come in," she said, stepping aside. He entered and she closed the door against the wind. They sat together on the floor backs, pressed against the wall for steadiness as the building trembled. She offered half her blanket, and he accepted, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. The warmth of his body seeped into hers, and she felt for the first time in weeks truly safe. They did not speak. Words seemed unnecessary. Outside, the wind howled and tore at the prairie. Inside, they sat together, breathing in unison, and waited for the storm to pass. When dawn came pale and quiet, he rose to leave. At the door, he paused. "I will teach you to shoot," he said. "Not for war, for protection. So you need never fear being helpless." "All right," she said, understanding what he was offering, not just skill, but partnership. The next day he brought a rifle, a Henry repeater borrowed from William, and took her to the bluffs above town. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight along the barrel without flinching at the anticipated recoil. "Elbow down," he said, standing behind her, his hands guiding hers with gentle pressure. His breath was warm at her ear, his voice low. "Don't let the recoil bite you. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull." She fired. The shot echoed across the prairie, and the target, a tin can set on a rock 50 yards distant, spun away into the grass. She laughed, surprised by the satisfaction of hitting what she aimed at. "Good," he said, and she heard the smile in his voice. Their eyes met as she turned, and for a moment the world narrowed again to the space between them. Then he stepped back, professional, and the lesson continued. 3 weeks later, on September 15th, William called a meeting at the schoolhouse. The room was packed, townsfolk, ranchers, Cheyenne from the agency, all crowded in, standing along the walls when the benches filled. He stood at the front, Ursula beside him, a thick ledger open in his hands. "We've been going through McKean's seized records," William said, adjusting his spectacles. "And we found something important." He held up a document, a list of payments to ranchers for water rights along Silver Creek. "These signatures are forged, which means the land McKean claimed was never legally his. The water rights revert to the original owners under territorial law. A murmur ran through the crowd, hope and confusion mixing. Including, William continued, looking directly at Eleonora. The parcels owned by Edward Voss. Miss Voss, your uncle's land parcel 12, which includes the headwaters of Silver Creek, was seized illegally. According to the Homestead Act and territorial statute, it reverts to his next of kin, you. Eleonora stared at him, her mind struggling to process the words. I don't understand. You own the headwaters of Silver Creek, William said gently, and under territorial law, you have the right to negotiate water usage with the town and the Cheyenne Agency. You control the source. Diani stood from her seat in the back, her weathered face calm. She spoke in Cheyenne, which Akacheta translated. We will share the water. Clean water managed together for all people, Cheyenne and white. This is the old way, the right way. The crowd erupted in discussion voices, rising with questions and hope. Eleonora felt dizzy, overwhelmed. She looked at Akacheta, who stood by the wall, his expression unreadable. After the meeting, as the crowd dispersed into the evening, they walked together to the hill above Silver Falls, where they had crossed the river weeks ago in fear and desperation. The water was calmer now, the current steady but not dangerous. Children splashed in the shallows, their laughter carrying on the wind, a sound that had been absent for too long. You going to paint more marks? Eleonora asked, gesturing to his face. Akacheta looked at the river, at the children playing. Then he crouched by the water's edge and dipped his hand in rubbing at the design on his face. One black bar came away, then one red chevron, and the pigment dissolving into the clear water. I will lose too, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. For Percy, who lived. For the mine, which is closed. The rest stay. For Tatanka. For Winona. For the ones we could not save. She knelt beside him, her skirt soaking in the wet grass. And the white clay. That stays. To see clearly. To remember. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the strip of cloth she had used to bind his arm in the mine weeks ago. It was stained with blood and dirt, but she had kept it, carrying it like a talisman. I don't know why I saved this, she said, holding it out. He took it from her hand, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his belt beside his knife. I do. Their eyes met. He touched his forehead to hers, the Cheyenne way of thanks, of respect, of connection deeper than words. She leaned into it, eyes closing, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steadiness of his presence. Neither spoke. The moment held sacred and fragile. Then she smiled, practical despite the emotion swelling in her chest. Supper before the town meeting tomorrow. We need to discuss the water rights agreement. He nodded, his mouth curving in that almost smile she had learned to cherish. Yes. They walked back to town together, the sun setting low and red across the prairie, painting the land in shades of fire and gold. In Widow's Well, life was beginning to rebuild. Ursula ran the telegraph office honestly, now free of McKean's influence, and offered reduced rates for a month as penance. Percy counted ballots for the special election scheduled for late September, his daughters helping, their small hands steadier now. The children chalked candidate names on the schoolhouse board, men and women who promised clean water accountability justice. And as evening fell on September 15, 1867, Akacheta rode the main street one last time before returning to his camp spear resting across his thighs, his design reduced to essential marks, testimony to the dead, reminder to the living. Those who had once mocked him now stepped aside, men removing hats, women nodding with respect, earned not through violence, but through courage and truth spoken in public under the dust and the hard prairie light. Eleonora watched from the schoolhouse steps, a shawl around her shoulders, against the cooling air. He saw her and inclined his head. She smiled, and the smile held promise. They did not declare anything loud or dramatic. There were no passionate speeches or grand gestures. They did not need them. The work they had done, the truth they had fought for, the lives they had saved, spoke for itself. And in the space between them, something had grown: respect, trust, and the beginning of something deeper, something that would unfold slowly, carefully, in the way of people who had learned that the most valuable things are worth patience. In the days that followed, the creek ran clearer, the children grew steadier, and the prairie stretched wide and unbroken beneath the endless sky. The U.S. Deputy Marshal's investigation confirmed what Akasheta had suspected. Edward Voss's death in 1862 had not been an accident. McKean had arranged it, paying a man to spook Voss's horse near a cliff edge. Justice for a 5-year-old murder was complicated, but the knowledge brought Eleonora a bitter satisfaction. On the 1st of October, the special election took place. A new mayor was chosen, a farmer named Jonas Keller, honest and unconnected to McKean. A new sheriff was appointed by the territorial governor, a former army officer with a reputation for fairness. And a water compact was signed by representatives of Widows Well, the Cheyenne Agency, and Eleonora Voss, guaranteeing shared access to clean water and joint oversight of the creek. Akasheta stayed through the winter, helping to finalize the cleanup and build the infrastructure for the water compact. He and Eleonora worked together, often planning, negotiating, building something new from the ashes of corruption. They shared meals, long conversations, by firelight, moments of comfortable silence that spoke of deep companionship. And on a cold December evening, when the first snow fell across the prairie like a benediction, they stood together on the bluffs and watched the white blanket cover the land. He took her hand, and she did not pull away. They stood like that, hands clasped, as the snow fell, and the prairie transformed into something clean and new. "Will you stay?" she asked quietly. "When spring comes?" He was silent for a long moment, then said, "If you want me to, want me." "I do," she said, and the words carried weight beyond their simplicity. He nodded, and they walked back to town together through the falling snow. Two people who had fought together and survived together and would build something new together on the frontier, where the old rules were breaking and new ones were being written in blood and courage and hope. And the prairie held them, vast and indifferent and beautiful as it had held generations before and would hold generations to come.